Hello, I'm Noel Kingsbury, and with Annie Gelfoyle, together we run Garden Masterclass. Welcome to our YouTube channel. We put here the recordings from the session we do every Thursday evening at 6 o'clock London time, a practice we started during the April 2020 lockdown as a way of reaching out to the global garden and landscape community. We hope you enjoy this recording, but also please do check out our website for all the amazing range of information-packed webinar and workshop recordings we have. Maybe consider joining us because members get access to our vast archive of free material as well as discounts on the webinar recordings. We've also recently started a podcast channel on Substack. So we do a weekly podcast so that's a way of accessing a lot of our recorded material that you can listen to whilst you're digging or driving or watering or whatever else. So I very much hope you enjoy this recording and looking forward to keeping in contact. Anyway, it's 6 o'clock. Welcome to Thursday Garden Chat, the weekly public service broadcast from Garden Masterclass. In terms of what we're organising, we're pretty much at the end of our pre-summer live webinar season. We've got one tomorrow, actually, with John Little, if anyone wants to join us at the last minute. And on the 17th of July, Annie is chairing a session of the Charleston Garden Festival with three lady garden owners or head gardeners who've inherited gardens made by amazing women. So if you want to find out more, do check out that on the diary pages. Looking beyond August, we are doing the naturalistic planting design course, again, starting at the end of September. And until the 1st of August, we are taking early bird bookings for that. We're also organising a very busy webinar and short course season for the autumn through to spring season, and I just imagine we'll be doing some sort of early bird offer, particularly for members. Also, I would remind you of our podcasts. We managed to get a podcast out on our Substack channel more or less weekly. And indeed, for Garden Masterclass members, we've got two series now recorded of podcasts, one with Ken Thompson talking about garden myths, a lot of iconoclasm going on there. And then there is a 17-part series with myself and Caroline Jackson talking about shrubs. And the idea is it's a fairly easy way of learning about a very wide range of garden and landscape shrubs whilst you're doing something else, such as weeding the garden, watering the garden, driving from one job to another, cooking the dinner, or whatever else. So we've got lots to offer you, lots to offer members in particular. So now today we are interviewing or having a presentation with the three curators from a wonderful exhibition in London at the British Library, Unearthed. And I'm just very sorry that my living in Portugal and actually being rather stuck here for one reason or another precluded my going to the exhibition, but we sent Claire Greenslade off and she came back full of admiration for this really remarkable exhibition, mining the British Library's huge archive of material, covering a very wide range of aspects of gardening. And I'm delighted that I was able yesterday to record a presentation with the lead curator of the exhibition, Maddy Smith, who's the lead curator of Printed Heritage Collections to 1900, co-curator Antonia Moon, who's the lead curator of the post 1858 India Office Records, and also Valentina Mirabella, who's the Curator of Romance Collections. So without any more ado, I will share my screen and play that recording. So, Claire, you managed to get to the exhibition, which is great.
I did. I went on one of the hottest days of the year, and the British Library is the place to be if you're too hot, because it was wonderfully cool in there. And I wasn't, to be honest, I wasn't really sure what to expect from the exhibition. I'd sort of read around it, but I wasn't quite sure what I was going to see. But I have to say, I came out of there so uplifted and so energized by the exhibition. It's such a good one and really worth every gardener, environmentalist, artist going to see, I'd say. I just felt like I left feeling really proud to be a gardener and like I was part of a gang that could be instrumental in helping the planet moving forward. I felt it was a really positive message. The exhibition it covers so much ground, but does it in a really eloquent way. Because, you know, to go from Gertrude Jekyll's boots to environmental issues, to community gardens, to colonialism, it's a massive exhibition. It's really huge in what it covers. But actually, the bit I came away with was the sense of community and the link with the community gardens. I also went behind the library and visited the story gardens, which was amazing to see because it looks like it's so well used by the local community there. So yeah, I just was really thrilled, and obviously having worked in a Jekyll garden, I loved seeing her boots. Did make me wonder if one day my Crocs would be on display somewhere. But I thought it was a really valuable exhibition. I was really glad that I went, and I bought the book. This will probably be back to front, won't it? But you know, the book, and I have actually read. You know, not often with a big book like that you read the whole thing, but I have read it from cover to cover whilst on my holiday in Cornwall, and that's a really good resource as well. And I thought it would be really good for especially almost younger generation of gardeners to read because it's really positive, but also we're not brilliant at looking forward a lot of the time, I think, especially with gardening. I mean, I've always worked in historic gardens, which makes me a culprit as well. But we're very often look back, and in British gardens, we hold on to this, like the historic part of it. But actually, it was really interesting seeing things from like Troy at Sissinghurst about, you know, the white garden and how is that going to cope with going forward, and how are they going to adapt it to make sense in a different climate and a different generation. So yeah, I found the book is brilliant with the show as well. So it's a thumbs up from me, Noel.
Great, thank you, Claire. That was a real recommendation, and really nice to sort of hear, you know, your own personal links with the subject matter. So I think over to you, Maddy.
Thank you very much for having us. It's really great for us to have the opportunity to talk about the exhibition. As Claire said, it's on at the British Library now, the site in St Pancras in London, and the exhibition's open until the 10th of August, so there's still plenty of time to see it if you're interested. I'm Maddy. I'm the lead curator of this exhibition, and in my day job at the library, I am a lead curator in the Printed Heritage Collections team. So this means that we curate and look after material printed primarily between 1601 and 1900, and that's books and newspapers and other types of printed stuff too. I'm here with my co-curators, Valentina, who's a curator in the Romance Collections in the European team at the library, and my colleague Antonia, who is a lead curator on the India office, of course. So, you're going to move. There we go. So the exhibition explores the history and the power and the impact that gardening has had over the centuries in Britain. And we really wanted to celebrate gardening in all of its different forms and explore how it can transform communities and also the lives of individuals as well. And it doesn't matter what type of space you have, everyone can garden in some way, shape or form. And we really wanted to celebrate like the universality of gardening. Gardening is much more than a hobby, more than the nation's favourite pastime. And we really wanted to show that it has quite a fascinating and often hidden history that deserves to be explored. And for us at the library, it's been a really great opportunity for us to showcase our collections of botanical and horticultural material and introduce them to the public. So on display in the exhibition are an amazing collection of medieval manuscripts, historic printed books, maps, garden plans, visual art and more. And we're focused on gardening rather than gardens because we really wanted to tell the story of like everyday gardening rather than the story of garden design, for example, or of sort of bigger estate gardens or historic gardens around the UK. We wanted it to have sort of recognisable themes and objects that everybody could relate to. Although these other themes do pop up in the exhibition as well. So because gardening has such a strong community element, we really wanted to reflect that in the exhibition. And indeed, one of the sections in the exhibition is called Gardening Together, and Valentina will talk us through that in a little bit. But we really wanted to collaborate with the local gardening organisations that we had around us in London as well when curating the exhibition. So the exhibition features 4 original films featuring Cocoa Collective, which are a London-based community organisation and garden. And we've included these because the films literally bring the outside in. It can be quite a sterile space in an exhibition gallery. And so these films were a lovely opportunity for us to show gardens and gardening. Because they were filmed over a period of months, they showcase a single community garden sort of over the seasons. And they also feature the gardeners themselves reflecting on the wider themes of the exhibition. And then we've also collaborated with Story Garden, who are managed by Global Generation, and that site is just behind the main library building, as Claire mentioned. So they have donated a number of objects into the exhibition space itself, and they've also worked with us at the library to replant some of the planting areas on the British Library Piazza. They were full of dead box plants previously, and so it's been a wonderful opportunity for us to update that and replace it with some wildflower meadow planting. So we start the exhibition proper with an introductory selection of key gardeners and gardening moments from across history. And these are in our lovely garden shed space in the middle of the exhibition. So we start with some wonderful miniature pictures of gardeners from a medieval manuscript, and then we carry on all the way up to the present day. So on the slide is the first manual about gardening to be printed in English. This is by Thomas Hill, and it's called A Most Brief and Pleasant Treatise, and it's the one second in from the right in the middle. This was published in 1564 during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. And gardening was really popular in the Tudor and the Elizabethan periods. So working class people increasingly had access to their own plots. Cottages were sold with gardens, and also market gardens were springing up outside the city walls of London and other urban areas. And gardeners also worked on grander estates such as Hampton Court Palace. But it wasn't until the next century that the first gardening manual aimed specifically at women was published. And this is on the right of the slide, and you can see the lovely designs for not garden layouts that feature in the book. So the book is called The Country Housewife's Garden. It was written in 1617. And women played a huge role in the history of British gardening. They cultivated domestic plots, kitchen gardens, and they grew herbs for culinary medicinal uses as well. They also employed weeders on bigger estates and also fruit pickers as well. And the Country Housewife's Garden is interesting because it specifically encourages women to develop a separate sort of productive plot, and then also have a separate ornamental plot as well. And people often think that people in sort of the medieval and the early modern periods didn't garden for pleasure, and they didn't have sort of ornamental gardens in the way that we have them today because they couldn't afford that luxury. But it seems as though they were, they were doing that, particularly in the 17th century. And then the 17th and the 18th centuries was a huge time of gardening innovation and development, really, in Britain. So the domestic gardening industry really sort of properly established itself, accompanied at the same time by the growth of the British Empire, which brought more and more plants to British gardeners, and plant nurseries and seed shops sprung up all over the country. And we have in the exhibition, to sort of capture this moment, some interesting illustrations of gardening tools and equipment by John Evelyn, who was a famous diarist and gardener, very keen gardener actually. And he had a wonderful garden at Sayes Court in Deptford, which was widely regarded as one of the most accomplished gardens in sort of 17th century London. Sadly, it's lost now. And he was one of the first to experiment with heating greenhouses as well, with very mixed results. But you can see the range of different gardening tools that were on offer, the different ways in which people were gardening at the time. Some tools are recognisable and some of them are very slightly weird, but hey ho. And then the last image on the slide is of the fantastic oil painting of John Stumlin that we have on loan in the exhibition from a private lender. And this is a very rare picture of a black gardener working in Georgian Britain. Stumlin was probably a victim of the transatlantic slave trade and was brought to Wales as a child. And he trained in horticulture and became a very accomplished gardener, and he spent the rest of his life there. This painting was painted from life when he was about 16. And it's really unusual for us not only to have the name of a black gardener from 18th century England, but also a portrait painted from life. So we're really pleased to have this on display. And this is fragments on the theory and practice of landscape gardening by Humphrey Repton, obviously a very famous garden landscape designer. And he was renowned for the way that he sold his designs to his clients. So he was very famous for having a sort of lift the flap design that showed the before and after of the proposed plan. And this book, Fragments on the Theory and Practice, it sort of encapsulates all of his designs and shows them all in the flat form. And then, as Claire said, also on display in this section, we've got Gertrude Jekyll's boots. We've got Jane Loudon's instructions in gardening for ladies, and the first of 4 films showing the Cocoa Collective community garden as well. And now I'm going to hand you over to Antonia, who's going to talk you through the next slide.
Thank you, Maddie. This section, Gardening to Nurture, is all about how gardening nurtures us in many different ways, both nurturing our bodies and our minds. We start off with nurturing to survive, that is, growing plants to eat, nurturing to thrive, growing plants for medicinal purposes, and nurturing to be happy, growing plants for general well-being. So historically, obviously, gardening was a practical necessity for many people because it was a source of food, whether that was working a humble cottage plot or the garden of a great estate. And we start this section by showing the surprising variety of food which people cultivated and enjoyed in the early modern period. This image on the left is from a 1636 book on gardening by the eminent botanist and gardener John Parkinson. And he devotes a chapter to the kitchen garden where he describes the herbs and the fruit and the vegetables which ordinary people can grow. And it's a beautiful book stuffed full of woodcuts. We could have opened it at any page and shown some lovely illustrations, but this is one of cucumbers, melons, and strawberries. And what Parkinson does is he stuffs his pictures with every kind of variety he knows. We've got 3 varieties of strawberry at the bottom here. We've got the garden strawberry, the prickly strawberry, and the great Bohemian strawberry. And Parkinson also gives culinary advice on how you should serve the fruits that you grow. And alongside this, we also show Evelyn's instructions. Maddie's mentioned John Evelyn, but he wrote a notebook of instructions to his gardener, listing a really impressive list of roots, salad, and pot herbs and sweet herbs that his garden was to grow. And it just shows how densely stocked a kitchen garden of the time could be. Also in this section, we look at growing food in times of crisis. We haven't shown pictures here, but we've borrowed materials from the Imperial War Museum to show growing food in times of the First and Second World Wars. We've got some lovely posters from the Dig for Victory sort of propaganda series, and also lovely watercolor painting from World War I showing amateur gardeners tending their allotment in London. And I think that these loans really sort of enhance the story that we're able to tell. And we also cover a modern crisis because we have a picture from the National Portrait Gallery of a gardener tending his rhubarb in the time of lockdown in COVID, so bringing it up to the present day. Moving on to growing plants for medicine. Obviously, from earliest times, people have used plants for remedies, but most of these were never written down. But some remedies were recorded in herbals, which are basically compilations of information about plants and their medicinal uses. And herbals were especially popular in Europe between about 1400 and 1600. But this one on the right you see here is slightly earlier. It's from the Anglo-Saxon period, and it dates from about 1025, and it's actually the earliest illustrated herbal that survives from this period. It's a translation of a text from late antiquity, and we've opened it at a picture of chamomile, which was prescribed. The text is in Old English, but the text prescribes chamomile as a remedy for sore eyes. Apparently, you were meant to eat your chamomile before the sun rose, and that would help your eyes. And the opening also shows heart's clover, and which was prescribed for gout, for inflammation, and for adder bite. This picture of a snake is quite common throughout the herbal to illustrate the herbs that you can use against a poisonous bite, which obviously would have been a consideration then when people were working mainly outside. And in this section, we also include a herbal from the Middle East. We have some original drawings for the famous 17th century work about Materia Medica in Malabar and South Asia, the Hortus Indicus Malabaricus. And we also look at medicine in the home. We display the very famous herbal of John Gerard, opened at a recipe for syrup of violets. And to bring it up to the present day, we've got an installation by Hackney Herbal in London, really to show that in an age of modern medicines, growing and foraging plants for their healing properties still has a place and a popular place. And the final part of this section is gardening for well-being. And this section includes growing plants really for the pleasure that the activity can bring. The illustration in the middle here is from an 1864 book by the Reverend Samuel Haddon Parks. It's called Window Gardens for the Poor. And Haddon Parks was a vicar in Bloomsbury, and at that time it was one of the poorest areas of London. And he encouraged his parishioners to grow plants in their homes. And he was recommending the kind of plants like fuchsias, geraniums, and lavender that could grow even in polluted air and dark rooms. And he set up flower shows. And this was, the flower shows became immediately popular and went well up the social scale. So really from Haddon Park's very humble beginnings of the flower shows sometimes that we know today. And we show this book alongside other exhibits demonstrating the popularity of growing plants indoors. We wanted to show, as Maddy said, that you don't need a garden necessarily to enjoy gardening. So we've got a plant pot in the shape of a hedgehog made by Josiah Wedgwood, which was very popular in the 18th century. And we have right up to the sort of the Bible for the modern houseplant expert, the David Hussein book, Be Your Own Houseplant Expert. So that's the range there. Could I have the next slide, please, Maddy? I thought I'd just include some garden plans which feature in this particular section. On the left is a plan of Sayes Court by John Evelyn, whom Maddy's already mentioned. Evelyn acquired Sayes Court, which was a 200-acre site on the Thames at Deptford in 1652. It really wasn't an ideal site because it's very windy, wind blew off the Thames. But Evelyn, he'd visited many gardens in Europe before this, and he spent the next 30 years of his life really planning and tending to his Sayes Court garden. And this is his first plan from 1652. It shows, I think you can see at the top, there's a parterre in the French style. Evelyn was influenced by the parterres that he had seen in Paris. You've got the Great Orchard on the right, you've got a grove, and right at the bottom, I don't know if you can see, there's some raised beds on a little island, in fact. And Evelyn, say, went back to his garden over the years. Events intervened. There was a terrible storm in 1683 to 84, which destroyed a lot of his orchard, so he had to replant it. And we've got the plan of that alongside this one, showing his ambitious plans for replanting his orchard with 21 varieties of dwarf pear and 12 varieties of cherry tree. I think it makes the point that someone with good connections, especially connections to Europe, could really be quite ambitious and plant a startling range of, in this case, fruit trees. And on the right, we've got a plan of Bethlehem Hospital Garden, the Bedlam Hospital of earlier days. In the early 19th century, the hospital moved from Moorfields in East London, St George's Fields in Southwark, the site which is now the Imperial War Museum. And in 1835, the architect Sidney Smirke was asked to enlarge the building to accommodate more patients, and this is his design. And the reason we chose it to exhibit was because it represents a kinder, sort of gentler approach to mental health than had been the case in the centuries before, because there are kitchen gardens which patients were encouraged to tend, even though, of course, this was a source of free labour for the hospital, but nevertheless, there were gardens. And there are also attractive landscape gardens, as you can see here, for the patients to look out on and to walk in. And so the beneficial effects of nature on health were beginning to be more widely recognised. And we put this alongside some pictures of Bethlehem Hospital today, which is now in South London, near Bromley. And we've included comments from the service user there to give a sort of testimony to the sort of healing power of the garden there. And just to note that in this section of Gardening for Wellbeing, a sort of theme emerged, the benefits of gardening for people who are confined in some way. We've got exhibits about soldiers' gardens, for instance, a garden in a refugee camp in Calais, and a herbal about prison gardens. So that was something that seemed to emerge while we were sort of selecting material, this common theme. So that's the end of the Gardening to Nurture section, and I'll now pass over to Valentina.
Thanks, Antonia. Thank you, Neil, for having us. So beyond the benefits for the individual, gardening also can put people and communities together. And in this section, which is in fact called Gardening Together, we look at social and political movements of which gardening has been a part of, either as a form of activism or as a part of the fight for access to land to cultivate. So the map on the left shows is an example of enclosure of common land, which is a phenomenon which we used to start off with Gardening Together. It started with the redistribution of plots of land left unused after the plague pandemic of 1348, and then between 1600 and 1900, there were a series of enclosure acts which took common land into private ownership. This phenomenon of enclosure fundamentally changed the British landscape, carving up common land into the patchwork pattern that we know today. And this map is from 1781. It does show this patchwork pattern in, so it shows how land was allocated in the year 1791 around the village of Bow-Brick Hill in Buckinghamshire. So there were controversial opinions about enclosure. Those in power saw economic benefits in it. So we take the opportunity to show a few pamphlets side by side in the exhibition. They are not shown here, but a 1653 pamphlet is called Bread for the Poor, and it makes the argument for enclosing common use pastures, farms and fields across England and Wales, saying that benefits included increased rental values, the ability to selectively breed cattle, and also to practice new agricultural techniques such as crop rotation. However, we know that the social consequences of enclosures were dramatic, and rural working people were forced into cities for work. This changed the shape of the country and sparked various waves of social unrest at different points, which we try to look at. So we have, after the Civil War, diggers and levelers who wanted to reform land ownership, extending or hoping to extend the benefits of enclosures to those the poorest in society. And so we show the iconic Gera Winstanley's pamphlet from 1649, as well as a really lovely later pamphlet that in 1797 celebrates the humble cottage garden as a life savior for the poor rural family of Britton Abbott, a man from North Yorkshire who was trying to feed his wife and 6 children whose lives, he said in his words, had been destroyed by enclosures. And on the right, we see, so throughout the exhibition, we've tried to shine a spotlight on some plants that we thought were important to tell a story. And in this particular case, we chose the potato. It's a humble plant, but its high nutritional value has contributed to its diffusion. Potatoes come from Peru and from Bolivia. Initially were brought to Europe in around the 1500s by Spanish colonizers, and Europeans initially were wary about the potato because it does belong to the poisonous nightshade family. So commonly it was more eaten the sweet potato. And the first English description of a potato appeared in John Jerd's Herbal in 1597. Potatoes are easy to grow and filling, of course, so they were quickly discovered as a way to feed the masses, really. And we take the opportunity to show the first book dedicated to potato called England's Happiness Increased from 1664 by John Forster, that argues that planting potatoes and using them to make bread could provide sustenance for English and Welsh families and also could generate income. So it has worked, and we then know that by the end of the 18th century, potatoes had become a staple, a monoculture, and ended with the potato blight, which caused widespread devastation across Europe around 1845. So can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Going back to resistance to the lack of land to grow for the working classes, we have socialist ideas behind the Levenshulme land grab at the start of the 20th century. And so these unemployed men, claimed land to grow food near Manchester, and they decided to grow cabbages. So on the right of this picture, we have this picture, which is a gigantic cabbage. You can see it in the exhibition. It's from a French album from a seed company called Album Villemorin. And today, the concept of allotment is still very much alive, and it does provide some space to enjoy and cultivate to those who live in the city. Smaller scale interventions are also celebrated in the exhibition, and because they increase the enjoyment of public spaces. So, for example, guerrilla gardening, but also the creation of meanwhile gardens. Meanwhile gardens take empty land and transform it into gardens while awaiting for development of in that plot of land. And the concept was invented by artist Jamie McCullough when he converted a neglected piece of land near Paddington in London into a community garden in 1976. So the garden became a testament to collective effort and is still a vibrant community space. And the concept of meanwhile gardens became widely used, as it is shown in this poster from 1981. Which is has been shown for the first time in the exhibition. It's a never seen before original design from the archives of the radical designer, printer and publisher Mike Braybrook, who was active in West London in the 70s and in the 80s. And of course, the British Library is very proud to have in the exhibition our own story garden, which Maddy did talk about a bit earlier. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So the lack of access to green space in the city has been behind the thinking of some visionaries, and one of these is John Loudon. Loudon was a city planner before others began to think about city planning as a job. He had a vision for the possibility of long-term planning for London's green spaces, and this work on the left is called Hints for Breathing Places for the Metropolis, was published in 1829, long before the concept of green belt was more widely included into city planning and thinking, because he envisioned city growth being carefully shaped and influenced by the inclusion of green belts, where he said everyone will never have to be more than half a mile away from green space, which is a revolutionary concept that then was taken on board by others, including Abesina Howard. And this concept is fundamental to the garden city movement, which we talk about in the exhibition, and was championed in Abesina Howard's book called Garden Cities of Tomorrow. So the green belt is a ring of agricultural and recreational land that surrounds a planned community to prevent urban sprawl. And the design principle of the garden city was adopted in the early 20th century to create new towns, for example, Letchworth and Welwyn Garden City, which aim to create a balance between urban and rural life, the best of both, they said. And on the right, we have a plan by architects Unwin and Parker, who conceived the first garden city at Letchworth as a blueprint for a joyous union of town and country. And that still inspires urban developments worldwide. So on the right, we have these original drawings for Hampstead Garden Suburb by Unwin and Parker. And we also borrow from Tate a painting that shows Hampstead Garden Suburb in 1912, when the painter William Radcliffe took a home in the area, which was originally meant to be for people of all classes and income to live together. And so, we also take the opportunity to celebrate many other movements. But for now, I think this is a good enough overview of gardening together. And I'll pass back to Maddy. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So this is Gardening Global Exchange. This section looks at how gardening connects us with our sometimes complicated past. When we were researching the exhibition, it became very clear very quickly that so many of our garden plants are not native to the UK. I think the sort of the very rough percentage is about 70%. And so we felt like it was hard to tell the story of British gardening without also exploring where these plants have come from and under what context. So we've divided this section into 3 subsections, looking at how plants have been identified during this period, how they've been reportedly discovered, and then how they have been grown in Britain and its colonies. So we start with a look at identifying plants. So we look at how people have identified and recorded plants over the centuries and how that has then filtered down to affect domestic gardening. This section contains some lovely examples of botanical illustrations from the library's collection, often painted from life in gardens themselves. So that really demonstrates that close link between like the development of botany and also domestic gardening at the time. The image on the right of the wonderful sunflower, this is from the Hortus Aestotensis, and this is a monumental book that was printed in 1613. So that's during the lifetime of William Shakespeare, to put it in a little bit of context. And it's widely regarded as one of the finest botanical works ever to be produced. So it captures on paper every single plant in a botanic garden in Germany, in Eichstätt, in Bavaria. And this botanic plant had plants growing from all across the world, including Asia and the Americas, which we were quite surprised by as early as 1613. And all of these plants are recorded here in very accurate and very rich detail. And it was the first time that all of the plants in a single garden had been recorded in one book. But it was also the first time that such a sort of very precise and accurate depiction of the plants had been made. So if you think back to some of the woodcuts and like herbals and stuff that we've looked at earlier in the exhibition, they're very sort of blocky, they're black and white, they are sort of somewhat crude images really of plants. And this was obviously completely different and changed the way that plants were illustrated from then on. And we're really lucky to have this hand-coloured copy in the exhibition. And it comes from our collection from the Library of King George III as well. So it was owned by royalty. And then we look at how these plants were discovered, reportedly discovered around the world by European botanists, colonialists, and plant hunters. So plant hunting and plant collecting has always been something that has gone on, but it really sort of gained a lot of momentum in that British colonial period. And nurseries, private gardeners, botanic gardens all commissioned plant hunters to go out and search for the sort of the most useful or the most exotic or interesting new varieties of plants. And this was useful, obviously, from an economic perspective for the British Empire. So, they collected like cultivars of tea and coffee and tobacco and that type of thing. But it also had a seismic impact on the domestic gardening trade as well. So in the middle, we have an image of the Wardian case that we're really lucky to have on loan in the exhibition. So the Wardian case was invented in the 1830s by Nathaniel Ward, and it allowed a living plant to be transported overseas and across huge distances for the first time. So it worked a little bit like a sort of field greenhouse, would say, or a field terrarium. It creates its own sort of microclimate inside, and it maintains a constant level of humidity. And this meant that plants could be packed up in Australia, say, and then they'd survive the sea voyage without any problems and arrive alive and healthy in London months and months later. And it really facilitated the movement of plants around the world on a massive scale. It had a huge impact on the economy of the British Empire and also on the domestic gardening trade. And a lot of the very prominent plant nurseries that sprung up in the 18th and the 19th centuries, they would use these Wardian cases when they were invented, and they'd get a huge influx of orchids, ferns, and other sort of plants that were very hotly desired by Victorian gardeners. And then the last image on the slide is of big Magnolia grandiflora. So this is from Mark Catesby's Natural History of the Carolinas. And it's here to really show the fact that there was a huge amount of shrubs and hardy shrubs and hardy trees that were brought back from North America in the 18th and the 19th centuries. And the Magnolia grandiflora was one of them. And it was transportable because the seed is quite chunky, it's easy to collect, it's easy to ship back to the UK. And in his book, Catesby notes that there are already a handful of gardeners already growing it back in London and in the southwest of England. It's important to also note that botanists and naturalists who are collecting these plants often had to rely on either indigenous knowledge or sometimes enslaved people to help them collect these seeds and plants as well. And then we look at how these new plants were grown back in the UK, but also across the British Empire. So we look at particular private gardeners and also the botanic gardens that were growing these new plant arrivals, from Kew Gardens to St Vincent Botanic Gardens in the Caribbean, and Calcutta Botanic Garden in India. So botanic gardens have existed for a very long time, but they were traditionally attached to universities for sort of study or as apothecary gardens to study medicinal uses. But the rise of the British Empire meant that sort of like the meaning of botanic gardens changed a little bit. So the new botanic gardens that were established across the empire, beginning with Kew, they were specifically there to sort of cultivate useful plants as well as ornamental plants, had a much wider scientific remit than the more traditional apothecary botanic gardens. So we have on display from our collections a hand-coloured early plan of Kew Gardens in the 1770s, and that's on the left. And you can see from the plan how it was originally a royal garden, and also how it had a menagerie as well, interestingly. And also in this section, we look at private individuals who were gardening pioneers as well. So the library is really lucky to have the papers in the archive of Mary Somerset, the Duchess of Beaufort, who was born in 1630 and she died in 1715. And unusually for women at the time, she was a highly accomplished and recognised gardener and botanist. And she maintained a level of correspondence and networks with sort of renowned scientific and botanical men of the day. And she was responsible for growing many new plants in the UK for the first time. And this is a wonderful engraving of her garden at Babington House in Gloucestershire. And you can really see the scale of her garden. And then the final section of the exhibition is about gardening with the planet. So gardening connects us to the natural world. We haven't always necessarily gardened with the health of the planet in mind historically, but today we're very much aware of how we as gardeners can make an impact and reduce some of the impacts of climate change through our gardening, whether that's for planting for pollinators or being careful and sustainable with our water use. So this section really looks at ideas around sort of biodiversity, sustainability in our gardens, and sort of tries to chart the history of some of those ideas. I think I've skipped a slide, but I'm just going to carry on. So this shows Gilbert White's garden journal on the right here. So Gilbert White was a naturalist who lived in Hampshire in his garden at Selborne, which you can still visit today. And you can tell by the way that he annotated his garden journal how very closely connected he was to the natural world through gardening. So for him, gardening was as much about growing fruit and veg, but also sort of noticing how many hedgehogs we saw in the garden today, the weather conditions, the wind and things like that. And so you can sort of really tell that close relationship. And that was quite unusual for someone who was gardening in the 18th century. And we also have in the middle here an image from Thomas Fairchild's The City Gardener, which was published in 1722. So Thomas Fairchild was arguably the first sort of urban gardener, really, a renowned urban gardener. His nursery was in Shoreditch in London, and it overflowed with very rare plants, including one of the first banana trees grown in London, apparently, grown in the UK even. And he was one of the first to argue that city gardening improved urban environments and that it supported wildlife and that it helped our general well-being. And he really encouraged city residents to grow anywhere they could, so window boxes, balconies, and on roofs. And he believed that gardening improved those urban environments and improved air pollution, etc., etc. And we have on the left here an image of the dandelion from the famous Herbal by Elizabeth Blackwell. And we've included this in the exhibition because we wanted visitors to think about whether or not we should be seeing certain plants as weeds, or whether we should be seeing them as sort of self-feeding plants that thrive in our local environment. Are all self-feeding plants weeds? Should we think about them differently? And sustainable gardening might mean letting some of these plants thrive and enjoying their benefits rather than trying against the odds to sort of eradicate them. And we thought the dandelion was a really good example of this. Nowadays, we traditionally think of it as a weed, but it's been used for its medicinal purposes in the past. It's been, I think, eaten at various points. It's a great self-feeding plant, and it's a fantastic plant for pollinators as well. And so I think there's definitely an argument for letting these plants live and thrive in our gardens, rather than trying to sort of go against the tide. And here are some interesting photographs of Faye Godwin, by Faye Godwin of Derek Jarman's garden in Dungeness. His famous garden is obviously on a very sort of notoriously inhospitable environment, and this has been transformed into a beautiful garden by planting the right plants in the right place, and so working with his conditions rather than against them. And we're lucky to have these original photographs by Faye Godwin in our collections. And then finally, we look at the role of the lawn in our gardens as well, from their sort of history in terms of their appearance in sort of country estate gardens. They were a very luxurious thing to have in your garden at the time because it was very expensive, both in terms of time and money, to sort of keep them manicured. They had to be sized by hand, which is very time consuming. And this indeed is a plan of Capability Brown's famous South Lawn at Blenheim Palace. But then the invention of the domestic lawnmower in the 19th century changed all of that, really. And we're lucky to have an example on display in the exhibition of that. From this point on, lawns became a sort of traditional feature of the suburban garden, and they still very much are a feature of many of our gardens today. But now we're considering, and we're more aware that there are other sort of biodiverse alternatives that we could maybe incorporate into our garden spaces, that would be more sustainable and more and sort of encourage more biodiversity in our gardens. And then the exhibition finishes with an installation called Pollinator Pathmaker by Alexandra Davy Ginsburg. And we wanted to finish on an optimistic note, but we also wanted to encourage visitors to sort of appreciate how our gardens and our garden spaces are not just for us, they're also for other wildlife as well. And this installation takes you on a journey through planting from the perspective of a pollinating insect. So it plays with ideas of sort of scale and size, but also of colour as well, and shows you how sort of varied and full of nectar our flower beds could be if we plant the right plants, and we can help all those pollinators thrive in our gardens. And then a quick note to end on, Claire's already mentioned the accompanying book that goes with this exhibition. So in the exhibition itself, we focus very much on the past and the present of gardening. And so we thought that it would be wonderful to explore what our gardens and gardening might look like in the future in our publication. So we commissioned 10 award-winning garden designers to come up with some unique designs and plans for how different types of gardens might look like in the future. So the types of gardens range from sort of community gardens through to rural gardens, and I think it finishes with looking at gardening in space and how that might look in the future as well. So it's well worth a read. The plans are wonderful, visual, very detailed, and then there's a very interesting commentary that goes with it. And then the curators of the exhibition have then linked back some of those themes and ideas back to historic examples in the exhibition space itself. And I think that's it from us in terms of the presentation.
Great, thank you. No, fascinating. Yeah, so glad you showed a picture of Hortus eichstättensis in Eichstätt in Bavaria. About 20 years ago, an organisation, I think funded by the Bavarian state government, took the decision to reconstruct that garden as much as they could. And made this remarkable collection of plants to sort of map out the contents of the book, and it's a really interesting place to go.
Yes, I can imagine. I'd love to visit. They've got very rich source material to draw from. So,
Yes, yeah. So Claire, any questions you had?
I really wanted to know how this exhibition came to be. Like, are any of you gardeners? Do you garden? Did it come from a spark of interest from you, or was it led through some other kind of through the library, or how did it come about?
Putting them on the spot, I think. Are you
sorry.
Show us your window boxes.
No window boxes, but I do have a garden. I'm a keen like gardener in my spare time. Amateur, I think, is probably the word, but I do love it, and I have gardened for many years. In terms of how the exhibition came about, I'd say it was a combination of that plus in my sort of job as a curator of the Printed Heritage Collections, I was so aware of some of the magnificent collection items that we have in relation to gardening, botany, and how sort of visual they were. And I was convinced that it would make a really interesting exhibition. And as I sort of carried on researching it, it became very clear that it wasn't just sort of those historic collection items that we had, but we had a huge variety of other collection items that would allow us to sort of tell a story of British gardening using a really sort of wonderful collection of material. And so we sort of ran with that really. It also fitted in really nicely with the library's sort of growing ideas around sort of sustainability. So the exhibition was an opportunity for us to try and design a very sustainable exhibition. I don't know whether you noticed, Claire, but there's one hell of a lot of wood being used in the exhibition. There's a lot of cork paneling. They're all very sort of carbon neutral or reusable materials. It's supposed to be very easily sort of deconstructed and put back up and reused elsewhere. We've reused a lot of like the hoods and the cradles and things like that in the exhibition too. And so I think for me, it was a sort of a combination of all of these things coming together, and it seemed like a really good opportunity for the library to put on a sort of somewhat surprising exhibition. I think it's not a very traditional exhibition in the sense that most people wouldn't expect the library to do a gardening exhibition, but we do have some wonderful things, and it was a real sort of pleasure to be able to get those out and show them to the public.
Yeah, great for us. And I really like the way that you went from past, present, and then with the book, the future, because actually often when you visit an exhibition and then you buy the book is just kind of like images from the exhibition, but this, you know, it harks back a little bit, but the book is brilliant for looking forward but linking with the exhibition, but still so different. It was still so worth buying the book. I'm not plugging it, but it's really worth
You can
it.
plug it if you want.
And what are you hoping, you know, what are you hoping, who are your visitors, do you think, to this exhibition, and what are you hoping they're going to take away with them?
So in terms of the visitors for the exhibition, I think we're hoping that we appeal to sort of two separate audiences, really. We're hoping that the collection of sort of historic, very visual material and the sort of the traditional appeal of British gardening appeals to people that often visit the British Library and sort of enjoy our sort of more historic exhibitions, our more traditional shows as well. But we're also hoping that because we have such a strong focus on sort of community elements of gardening and local communities, and we've engaged very directly with sort of community gardening groups around the library, that we're hoping to sort of pull in some of those visitors as well. We've had a space outside in the British Library Piazza at various points. We had a great garden fete a couple of weeks ago. And so we're hoping that that presence and that visibility really draws local people in. And specifically to do that and to make the library as accessible and open as possible, we've come up with a reduced ticketing offer for local residents as well. So local Camden residents can visit the exhibition for £1. So
Oh,
really,
that's brilliant.
there's no reason why.
That's really nice. That I'm not sure whether I've seen
Yeah.
that before. Is that a frequent thing with BL exhibitions?
So in the past, we've done the occasional sort of pay what you can offer, and they've always been quite well received. But because we specifically wanted to sort of attract those local community audiences, we thought we'd do it from the off with this.
Yeah, brilliant. And does it work, do you think?
We haven't got the statistics back
you
yet,
haven't got
so
your
I don't
statistics
know.
back. Right, interesting. No, really good thing to do. Just wondering whether there were any particular gaps, any things that you really would like to have shown, but actually there's a shortage of material for one reason or another.
There are many things we would have liked to show. I'm sure that Antonia and Valentina come up with some things that they would have liked to have shown.
I think, yes, I mean, for example, Valentina mentioned the plant spotlights, and everyone has their own favourite plant that they might want to be represented, but we were limited really by terms of space to 5 plant spotlights. I remember doing some research into rhubarb, which I thought would make an interesting plant spotlight, but finally there wasn't the space to show it. And also this, as you can imagine, is sometimes dictated by the availability of suitable visual materials, and it was quite difficult to find visual materials of historics of rhubarb. So we hope that people have been, I think all the 5 spotlights that we have in the exhibition tell an interesting and perhaps an unexpected story, but we have had visitors who say, oh, but why didn't you mention irises, all this? And so, but as I say, it's a selection, and we could have done 10, 15 spotlights easily.
Yeah, I'm sure you could. Yes, yeah.
I really loved the the other thing I took away from the exhibition is that when you looked at all the historical context, so much of it was about control, like control over humans or control over plants. And then as the exhibition went forward through time, it was really lovely to see how actually the benefits now are about letting go of that control, not having such a tough human hand, and rewilding where we can, letting the dandelions come up. They had a really lovely sense of freedom, and I really loved. My favorite part, I think, was the lawnmower next to that huge poster. I don't know, Noel, if we're allowed to swear on here, but it shows the original lawnmower with this huge poster that basically says FUCK lawns, and and it's a really 60s psychedelic kind of looking poster, and I just thought it was a really lovely juxtaposition of 2 items. I thought you were very brave in how you put the exhibition together.
Yeah, great. Good. Marvellous. Well, thank you so much for your time. It sounds a fascinating exhibition, and we very much recommend that all our viewers go and visit it and buy the book, of course. And thank you very much, Claire, and thank you very much for your time today.
No problem.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.